Welcome, conservationists. I'm happy that you could take time out of your day to come and sit down and have a chat with me here. This is an experimental thing that I'm going to try to do. It's going to be a series of monthly talks on the second Thursdays of the month to talk about different management and habitat topics. Take an hour and just discuss this kind of stuff. And today we're going to talk about management choices for habitat health, as the title slide indicates. But really, what it's going to be is a 30,000 foot kind of overview of different management choices that you might be confronted with. I don't know how many answers there's going to be, quite honestly, because there is land management just as a whole, regardless of whatever your goals are, is complicated. And there are a lot of options out there. And we're just going to kind of give a quick overview of the most common ones. That is the goal. So if you think about it, in the future, we'll talk about some of these things in more depth. So stay tuned on that. We'll talk about that later. So a little bit about me. If you're not familiar, my name is Jason Anderson. I'm a wildlife biologist with Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever. I work in a partnership with the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service to provide habitat assistance to usually farmers or landowners. So my tagline is we help people build habitat, because that's really what we do. We build habitat in agricultural areas. And we do that through partnerships. Pheasants Forever is partnered with the USDA and other local partners, such as the DNR, Lost Hills Alliance for me, and soil and water conservation districts, as well as the Pheasants Forever chapters, to provide matching dollars for a grant that funds my ability to go and do work. So without those partnerships, I just wouldn't be able to do the things that I do. And I really like my job, so I am happy that they are doing that. All right, let's get into it here. The unfortunate reality is that habitat takes work. There is maybe a misconception that when you plant an area to grasslands, most of the time when I talk about grasslands, I'm actually talking about prairie. So native grasses and wildflowers. There's a misconception that if you plant those areas down, that it is just kind of a set it and forget it thing. And unfortunately, that is just not the case. It requires work, maybe less work than other land uses, but work all the same. And when we talk about that work, we're talking about management and doing management practices. This is Clint in this picture here, and this is his little pollinator planting that he has outside of Kirkman, Iowa. Clint has had just about every problem that you could possibly have with his pollinator stand, and he has been I've been helping him out basically since I started this job in 2015. For this picture, I said, Clint, stand there and look proud of this thing. He's like, I don't know if I can do that. Anyway, thanks, Clint. I use him as an example all the time. And it leads me into like expectations, right? So this, we have a grassland or a prairie that we worked hard on. We have this hope, this expectation that it's going to be filled with wildflowers or whatever your thing is, depends on, again, your goals, which we'll get into here in a little bit. But we have an expectation that it's going to be this great, beautiful thing. And that is often just not the case. The reality is that those stands are kind of filled with problems, and oftentimes, so you might get poor establishment, or there's always going to be trees coming in. So just like right here, right? Trees, this big old patch of, I think, maybe dogwoods or Siberian elms, something like that. Either way, cool season grass like brome encroachment or invasive weeds, Canada thistle, there's always going to be problems. And that is just the reality of it. And that's why we need management. The whole point, I am very goal driven. So whenever I work with a landowner or I'm coaching one of my conservation cohorts on how to deal with landowners or producers, whatever term you want to use, I teach them goals first, right? So you have to have goals, make decisions that work towards those goals, and go and do the thing. And that's what we're going to be really focusing on. Establish goals, use the ecology of the stand to your benefit, and then the pitfalls that we can get into, what management practices you can work on, what your options are, your choices, if you will, and then how you evaluate your success. So we'll get into talking about the goals. I love goals. One of the first things I ask people when we go out on a farm is, what is your vision? What do you want to accomplish out here? And, you know, that might seem kind of, what do I want to say? Abstract, maybe, right? So, but it's important. We'll just take Marcos here for an example. So Marcos is a big pheasant hunter, as is his family, and he purchased this farm. He's actually from Texas. It's a very interesting story. He's like the opposite of an absentee landowner because he's from Texas. He came up pheasant hunting with his good buddies, and he liked it so much that he bought this farm in Shelby County. And so he manages it pretty much exclusively for pheasant and quail hunting. So that is his goal. He wants a place, a preserve where his family can go and they can go hunting. So that drives his management choices. So when you're considering what you want to do on your farm, or if you are working with someone that is considering what to do on their farm, ask them what their vision is, and then you can set achievable goals based on that vision. And that is what drives everything. And you don't need to necessarily delve into, well, if somebody wants pheasants versus if they want monarch butterflies, or maybe they have a bee operation and they want nectaring for their honeybees or whatever. I mean, I'm not going to get into that level of depth, but just ask the question, what's your vision? Set goals. That is absolutely the most important thing, because it is going to push all of your decisions going forward. All right, goals, super important. And now we're going to go back to high school, and we are going to talk about ecology. I know that this might be, I am super excited. As a biologist, I am very biased for liking science, but we're going to talk about it a little bit. So the basic premise that we are operating under is a principle called secondary succession. And basically, the really dumbed down, simple version of that is that grasslands over time will turn into forests, okay? And that is, we are going to be working within that structure. That is where we work with our management. So in number one up here, we have the happy grassland. Look how happy it is, right? And then over time, as we go to the left, 1, 2, 3, 4, you have trees and shrubs will start kind of poking in to that grassland. And then just over time, because they are able to outcompete the grasses and the wildflowers, you get more trees. And then eventually it turns into a forest, a climax community, if you will. That's the very simplistic idea. And this takes place over time, right? So 10 years, 20 years, 100 years, it just depends on the speed. Unfortunately, when we get into talking about invasive plants, they can establish very quickly and take over. But this is just a very, what do I want to say? A very simplistic view of ecological succession. Grasslands turn into forests. And then you have disturbance, and that will reset. It's like a reset button. So in this example, if we go through 1, 2, 3, 4, it turns into a forest. And then if you have potentially, like in number 6, probably it is a catastrophic fire, goes and basically burns all of the vegetative material back down to soil. And then in number 8, you have your kind of early successional annual weedy stuff. And then eventually that prairie cover is going to loop back from number 8 back to 1. Okay. And it's a cycle that continues. So that is how disturbance is a reset button. But that disturbance could happen. I mean, in this example, it's happening in number 6, but it could happen in number 2 or number 3 or in number 1. Any of those times, you just kind of reset that succession from happening and keep that grassland habitat in that healthy state. We are going to be using, for us as land managers, we're going to be using this ecological principle to benefit ourselves, right? So we are using, for example, this example, we're using fire. Fire is a management tool that is very effective. And it's also a disturbance that keeps that habitat in a woody free or woody low kind of state, in that number one happy box that we were talking about. And I just want to point out, I want you to remember number 8 over here with the with this early successional kind of weedy state, because that is where a lot of the problems come in that we're going to be talking about. Speaking of problems, we're going to get into the weeds and trees. So we have that basic ecology out of the way, where grasslands are turning into woodlands or forests, whatever you want to call it. And then disturbance is resetting it. But those management activities, those management practices, they are going to have consequences. And usually those manifest in the form of weeds and trees in very broad sense. Here's some examples. So on the left here is our favorite plant. It is a Canada thistle. So Canada thistle is it's a noxious weed in Iowa. It's introduced and invasive, and just about every landowner in Iowa has had to deal with Canada thistle or its close relatives at some point in time. It's a super common problem when you're managing grasslands. And then the other two is what we were talking about with succession, where grasslands want to turn into woodlands. In the middle there, that's just a grassland that has a bunch of cottonwoods sprouting up in it. Super common in wet areas, especially. Again, we're not going to get into the details on how to control these things necessarily, but I just wanted to show you some examples of how these are causing problems. And then on the right, that is actually a prairie remnant, a prairie remnant, meaning that it was never plowed. So it is a historically intact grassland that has been not managed, basically, and that it's just been grown up into smooth sumac. That is what is over at Mr. Gravy here. He is about 6'3", and so that sumac stand is about 12, 13 feet tall, probably. So that you can see now, like when the trees grow up, they shade out the stuff underneath it. And that's how it can just slowly overtake those grasslands over time. This happened over probably 15 years, but over time, the grasslands will turn into woodlands, and that's how. But so aside from that, aside from the problems, the point is that with all these problems that you're going to face, and every project is going to be different. Every farm is going to have its own special set of problems that are going to need to be addressed. And really you have to find a balance. You have to find and that might be tough, but you have to find a balance that meets your goals and doesn't, really, you have to find a balance that meets the objectives, that keeps the stand healthy and meets your goals and solves all your problems, or at least as many as you can. And that can be a struggle. And we're going to talk about in future webinars, we're going to talk, I think in June, June, I think we're going to talk about, I have one that's specifically devoted to Canada thistle control. And then at some point in time, we'll talk about brush management as well, because I'm all about cutting brush and promoting prairie. That's for sure. All right. So those are the problems. You got the ecology, you got the problems that can come along with that. And now we're going to get into the meat and potatoes of the talk, which is the actual management practices. So there are many different options for how you can manage different practices that you can use to manage your ground. I am only going to talk about 4 of them, but there are many more. Just to just to make sure that everybody understands that this is not an exhaustive discussion or list. We're just going to talk about the 4 most common practices for managing grasslands. Just know that there's going to be more that are available. And I would encourage people to experiment, honestly, because you'll find that there's no, well, we'll talk about this in the end, but there's no one answer for any given set of problems or a farm. So you can experiment, try different things, try different specific ways of doing these practices. But we're just going to talk about, again, 30,000 foot view. And then at some point in time in the future, we're going to revisit and talk about these things just a little bit more in depth in the coming months. So first off is disking. You run it's a farm implement for tillage, and you just run it through your grass stand. And it's very common, and some people will be just completely appalled that you want them to do that, or you suggest it, or that other people do it. Because if you have a grass stand, if we look at this stand specifically, look at this nice chunk of grass, right? It's all, I wish I had a zoomed in or a better picture of that, but it's a nice, great stand of grass, right? So why would you ever want to break it up? Well, what happens with grass is it will become sod bound. The way the growth form of grass, it will just create this thick blanket of root material and litter above it that basically will not allow anything to compete with it. And then those individual plants will start to compete with each other, and they get into an unhealthy condition. So when a stand becomes sod bound, ultimately it is less healthy. There's less total plants growing out there, so the diversity goes down, and the plants that are there suffer for it. And incidentally, trees can also persist in a sod bound stand because they're just more persistent, deeper rooted, and able to compete with those sod bound grasses. And that is how it's actually the sod bound grass will help tree growth, interestingly enough. And so the idea of disking is you go out, you turn up some soil, you expose the seed bank that's there, and you allow other plants to come back or express themselves is the term. The bad thing about disking, all that is great because it brings diversity into the stand. However, the bad thing is it doesn't kill trees. And oftentimes that exposure of the seed bank causes a flare up in annual weeds, including thistles, which is usually a big problem. But again, there's no good one answer for it. Spraying, another one that gets people all worked up. Herbicide use for just the fun of it is generally looked down upon in our society, I would say. But as long as you are targeting your spraying to accomplish a specific goal, right? We're all circling back to goals. It can be a good thing. So spraying you can use to control undesirable plants, including trees or introduced grasses that might be encroaching from the edges of your field. If you're having if you have a prairie, that is always going to be the case. Smooth brome seems to always creep in from the sides, and you can control it through selective and specific herbicide use, which can be good for sure. You can also spray in patches to control different little spots around your farm. The bad thing is that it's quite aggressive, and you can end up getting collateral damage and using that herbicide on plants that you didn't intend to, and then now they are dead, right? So that's what we're talking about when I say collateral damage. You're spraying the thing that you want to get rid of, but then you also kill the thing that you did not want to get rid of. And that is my standard advice when I'm talking about spraying anything, whether it's for grass control or thistles or whatever, is to be as targeted as you can stomach, basically. So whatever that means, be as targeted as you can stomach, because if you can get up there and spray that individual plant, if that is your tolerance for being targeted, great, do that, because that is absolutely the best thing. because you are putting that herbicide on the plant that you specifically do not want, as opposed to broadcasting it more widely and then increasing your risk of collateral damage. Prescribed fire, absolutely my favorite one, and that's why I put best option for native stands in there. I did put it in quotes though, because it's not always the best for everyone. For native stands specifically, those plants are adapted to fire because historically fire was fire was, before humans came along, Europeans came along, a natural part of our ecosystem, of that prairie community. So in pre-European settlement times, we know that Native Americans used fire in the prairies every 4, 5 to 10 years. And we know that the prairies burned off and it actually rejuvenated that community. And so by using prescribed fire and reintroducing that as a natural part of the system, you're going to get a lot healthier stand. And you can use fire in introduced grass stands as well, but the effects aren't as prominent as if you used fire for native stands. Fire it promotes diversity of your wildflowers and your grasses. It'll stimulate and make your individual plants more vigorous. And that's good for just overall stand health. It controls trees, and it can also set back invasive grasses. So we were talking about introduced grass coming in from the edges and you use spraying. Well, you can also accomplish the same thing or very similar with fire. Now, the bad thing about fire, of course, is that, how to put this, it's logistically challenging, right? There are safety concerns with the implementation of fire. Safety should be the number one thing that you are considering if you're thinking about doing burning or suggesting burning. Safety is the number one concern. Can you safely accomplish the burn while also accomplishing your ecological objectives? And also, aside from the safety aspect, there's also a timing concern, and that's part of the other side of that coin when I say that fire is logistically challenging, because the fire will have very different effects depending on the timing that the burn is conducted. If you have a native stand and you burn it in the spring, it's going to have very different effects on it than if it was burned in the fall, for example. I would love to talk more about this stuff, but we're just not going to be able to. We don't have enough time, unfortunately. But I am definitely going to be continuing to discuss prescribed fire in these hourly reports because people have a lot of questions about it. And so the more knowledge I can share about that, the better. Last is haying. Not last. The last thing I'm going to talk about is haying. So I wrote on here, promotes stand diversity. And what I had originally written before I changed it was that it acts like fire, but it's worse. And I thought that perhaps I should change that to be a little bit more, I thought maybe I'd make someone mad. Anyway, but it's actually true. So haying functions much like fire, except for it just doesn't do as good of a job, honestly. So you're doing a lot of the same things as fire when you are haying. You're removing all the material, and the timing will function much in the same way as well. So you can get different effects. Much like fire, you can get different effects by haying your stand in different times. It just doesn't do as good of a job. So for example, when you have trees that are growing up in your stand and you go and hay it, well, you're just turning your trees into shrubs, because it doesn't, for the most part, doesn't kill them. It'll just cause them to sucker from the ground. And then, yes, you are removing the material from above ground, but then you're not getting that nutrients that the fire would. If the fire burns up the material and all the nutrients, the carbon and everything else goes back into the soil, well, you are taking all that stuff and loading it up on a truck and you're feeding it to cattle, right? So that's why I say that it doesn't it does a lot of the same things that fire does, just not as well. But it is good for promoting diversity, especially for wildflowers. Now, I will also say that some people are going to be enrolled in a Farm Bill program, and so such as the Conservation Reserve Program, CRP. That is the window that enters people into having grasslands, right? And I haven't talked about that because I kind of wanted to keep this program neutral so that the information I'm presenting isn't specific to any specific program or anything like that. But with haying, I need to mention that there are special provisions for haying on land that is enrolled in a Farm Bill program. So make sure that if you are entered into a program, if you're doing any kind of management, be sure that you check with whoever is the administering agency, whether that be the Farm Service Agency or the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service or the Iowa DNR or the Fish and Wildlife Service or whatever. There are all kinds of different administering agencies for different programs out there that are available. And you need to if you're enrolled in one of those, if your land is, you need to make sure that if you're doing any kind of management whatsoever, whether it's haying or burning or whatever, you need to make sure that you are doing that management in accordance with whatever rules you're enrolled under. Haying specifically is a problem. It's great, but there are rules that kind of make that a problem if you have ground in CRP. But know that it is a great tool. This guide is available through the USDA, and it's quite good. So it's establishing and managing native plantings, and there's a lot of good information in there. Mostly it focuses on the first 3 or 4 years of the stand, because if in a lot of cases we as USDA staff or NRCS staff, I guess, we are helping people establish new prairie plantings. And so that means going from crop to prairie cover. And so they have a lot of questions about the first few years of that management. But the last half of the document actually talks about year 3 and beyond, I think is what it talks about. And there's a lot of really interesting, good advice in there that I am not covering, but I'm kind of hitting on. And if you read through that, if you're interested in more information, that's a quick and easy way to get that. And I'll also have where you can download that at the end of the talk. All right, so we have all of our, not all, we have many of the common, many of the common practices, not all of them. And it's really important to revisit and look and see, are we being successful? That's the question, right? So that's where adaptive management comes in. And that is basically a fancy way of saying trial and error, because there's just no there's no silver bullet. Like I said, every farm is different. Every project is different. Every location has its own suite of problems or its own suite of invasive species, or maybe there are more thistles in this area of the county than others or whatever. So you have to consider every farm individually and see what it needs. And there is no one single management tactic or practice that is going to solve all the problems. And that is why I encourage people to, yes, you have these 4. There are other ones out there: mowing, grazing, spot spraying, brush management. There's all kinds of management techniques that you can do in addition to these to potentially meet your goals. And unfortunately, it's complicated. I wish it was not, and it was much easier, but then I probably wouldn't have a job, because my job is to help people navigate all these choices and make suggestions and help them decide what is best for them. Really, like I said, it's trial and error. So there's the cycle, right? You have a plan, and most often your first plan goes all to hell and you have to change it, right? So you make a plan, you go and you do the thing, and then you look and you stop and you look back at what you did and how the stand reacted. You evaluate it, to see, were you successful? And if you were, great, excellent. If not, well, you need to maybe go back and reevaluate what you were doing, and hopefully you learn from that. And it's a cycle. That's what adaptive management is. So and like I said, it is a fancy word for trial and error. But yeah, make a plan, go do it, and then look back and see if it worked. And if it didn't, tweak it and see what you need to do differently. And maybe you just need to use different practices, or slightly tweak a practice that you liked. Like maybe you liked doing fire, but it didn't react exactly the way you did it. So maybe you're going to try and burn it in a different month, or on different weather conditions, or whatever. Or maybe you ran the disc too deep and turned the field a little bit too black, or whatever. So it's an adaptive cycle. Just, it's not mistakes, it's just learning. You will find through management, if you ask a land manager what their opinion is on this or that practice, you'll probably get several different answers, some of which might be very different. And really the reality is that these systems, especially native systems that are diverse and have a lot of different plants in them, they are very resilient. And it's unless you are doing something very wrong, as long as you are doing something, trying to move in the right direction, you're really not going to go wrong. You're not going to break them, if you will. Like I said, I mean, you could do something very wrong, but as long as you're trying to do the right thing under good direction, yeah, don't be afraid to try different things, because you're not going to destroy the stand by experimentation with different management regimes. All right. So I want to recap. This is the slide that's got the most words on it. So super important to establish a vision and set clear goals that are achievable. Okay. So ask them what they want to accomplish, and then make goals towards accomplishing those objectives or the vision, right? And then use ecology to your advantage. And this, not just what we're talking about with succession, but you can use the biology of plants, or the animals that, if you were managing for individual wildlife species, any of that stuff, educate yourself and use that ecology and biology to your advantage. Super important. And it also makes short work of stuff, or shorter work of stuff. If you're using Mother Nature as your ally, you're going to get a lot of mileage out of that. And then with your problem, strike the best balance you can. And that's why I said the best balance you can, because there's always going to be trade-offs. There's going to be collateral damage. I mean, there's going to be economic concerns and everything else. There's going to be so many different factors that are going to go into planning your management that you just can't check all the boxes for sure. So strike the best balance that you can. And then use the management, whatever that management might be, to meet your goals, right? So you have a vision, meeting the goals. And so when you're making your decisions on all these management choices that you have, make sure that they are working towards your goals and you're implementing them in a way that is enacting your vision, right? We just talked about the disking, spraying, prescribed fire, and hang, but there's other things, and certainly use a combination of things as well if you want to. Just depends on, again, the goals of what you want to accomplish. And then evaluate and adapt. So you want to always, when you're walking forward, we're making progress, but you want to look back and make sure you keep an eye on where you came from. That's definitely, in addition to the vision and goals, the adaptive management, the evaluate and adapt, that is equally important, I would say. So you got to know where you're going and also how you got there, because that is going to give you an idea of what you need to do in the future.